Thanks everybody for coming. We really appreciate you taking the time to attend this webinar today. This is the 14th episode of Future of Freight, a very fun series that we've been running now for nearly a year about technology trends within logistics. And one of my favorite parts about it is that it's an opportunity to geek out about some particular aspects of freight, sometimes that get a ton of attention and sometimes that get a little bit less attention. And this is a fun one. It's one that we've encountered a bunch in a couple of different facilities, both on the carrier side, looking a little bit on changing consumption trends, but also on smaller new buyers that are getting into global freight. And LCL is something that I think everybody talks about, but I've never really had the opportunity to go incredibly deep. And that's why I think today is going to be a really, really interesting episode. As always, if you have questions that come up during the course of the episode, we've gotten a bunch before we started recording through the registration. But if you have any questions that come up, I like to stay on my toes, and I'm looking forward to keeping Graham on his toes. So please feel free to pop them into the Q&A section or the chat section. I don't really know which one is better, so I'll just stick with whatever everybody here is comfortable with. I want to introduce you. I'm Ethan Buchman. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at the Freightos Group, but I assume everybody is now here for Graham. So Graham, why don't you welcome first, and can you tell us a couple of words about yourself and about Vanguard?
Well, great. Good morning, everyone. Look forward to our conversation. I head up strategy at Vanguard, been with Vanguard for 8 years or so. My interest and passion is always about the projects that make companies better and more successful in the future. Vanguard, if you don't already know, is the leading LCL network globally. We've been at the forefront of that industry now for nearly 45 years. We've grown to more than 35 countries, and we're very passionate in working in the industry with partners to be successful in moving freight. Awesome.
And what a time to be a chief strategy officer at an organization in the middle of an industry that's changing so quickly. That must keep you on your toes a lot. A quick word about Freightos first before we dive into the actual questions and why we really spend so much time looking at these things. So we love talking about this stuff, and we love talking about it because what Freightos does is basically create a digital backbone across carriers, freight forwarders, and shippers of all sizes. And it's really interesting to see how different parts of the data around international freight, around pricing, around booking, around shipment management, how that plugs into different aspects of international freight. And one thing that, of course, comes up for us a lot is where companies choose to put their chips, the proverbial chips, when it comes to digitization. Is it around the shipment management side? Is it around sales? And more interestingly, over the past couple of years, started with us as bystanders and then getting a little bit more involved, but watching very carefully as companies start to step out from building an internal technology stack and start looking a little bit more at how they can expose their technology stacks to other companies in the value through APIs. And it's something that I think is incredibly exciting. We see this in the tech sector with companies like Stripe, and now we're starting to see it much more in the international freight side. So I want to kick off kind of maybe a little bit of an easy kind of low ball underhand throw for you, Graham. One of the things that we've been watching over the year or so, especially since COVID kicked in, is that there's been this incredible spike in the number of small buyers, these small e-commerce sellers that have never really tried their hand in international freight. I think the barriers for global trade, even though, of course, this was a very, very difficult year, the barriers for global trade have really come toppling down over the past couple of years. It's really become incredibly easy to source overseas, to move those goods over, import them through a variety of different channels, whether it's working directly with Amazon, with freight forwarders, with platforms. And then once those are stateside or wherever you're looking to sell them, using platforms like Shopify or platforms like Amazon. And we're seeing this incredible growth of e-commerce sellers. And that, of course, has drove a lot of loose cargo utilization. And of course, that's probably been aggravated by the fact that everybody wants to ship things and it's so hard to get space on containers. And that's probably pushing even more regular FCL shippers to start looking at LCL in order to fill holes in their supply chain. At the same time, one thing that we've noticed, and this is a weekly chart that we put together of costs to import to a variety of Amazon FBA centers. And one thing that's always stuck out to me is that the door-to-door cost of shipping by air cargo or FCL fluctuates a lot. And LCL fluctuates, obviously we're talking about an LCL container, so it costs a little bit less and you'd accept a little bit less fluctuation, but it's shockingly stable. And maybe our data's off, but at the same time, it seems like it's not necessarily experiencing those same fluctuations. And all that leads me to say that this is an incredibly interesting space right now because there's so many new people that are looking at it. There's so many new ways to consume LCL as a service, and there's so many specific nuances that I think have really popped up. And I guess the question for you, and these are like 15 questions that could probably take an hour to answer. What is it from your perspective, right? You look at Vanguard as an expert in the LCL space. What makes it so unique, and what's changed in how companies or consumers are consuming LCL as a service?
No, it's a great question, and I think when you look at LCL from the inception, it was always there as a cost sharing model for shipping containers. It was always there as a flexible option for small shipments. And that is still true today. We are sharing the economics of a container with 10 or 11 shippers in a container. And it's often overlooked. I think people focus on the port to port, less on what happens in the warehouse, in the inland logistics. Those costs have become much more significant. And at the same time, people need the flexibility to move their cargo in smaller lots closer to the customer, to the distribution center, the fulfillment center. And that's where LCL comes in. They are wide networks. They're reaching into inland points. They are enabling solutions from multiple suppliers into distribution locations that are close to customer. So you're getting lowest cost, you're getting flexibility. You also get the frequency. We run a service. Every Friday, you can go from Hamburg to New York. Again, that is a service that is committed, it's regular, so a customer, when you can get on the vessel and when you can move a small piece of cargo.
And do you feel like the way that users rely on LCL or what they look for in LCL has changed over the past couple of years?
It will be. I think often LCL has been seen as a little complicated. It involves many vendors. The pricing is opaque often. It's a little unsure, who you're really working with to move from A to B. And that tended to favor FCL in the past. It's one container, it's for the shipper, you're in control of it. But I think as e-commerce is really changing how people look at their supply chains, and how do I get closer to the endpoint, and that technology is simplifying LCL, then people will become more confident in using LCL as a core staple to their supply chain needs.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear about the technology impacting it. I was recently talking to a friend about the evolution of containerized shipping and trying to explain to him how complicated it was before containers were there. We're just throwing stuff onto a ship and hoping that you can find yours. And the truth is that LCL to some extent becomes like a regression towards that same idea where you're sharing containers, but with multiple users. I think that creates, to some degree, it could create a certain amount of liability from a shipper perspective. But before we talk about the technology that kind of has helped resolve some of those underlying issues, can you talk a little bit to the challenges? Like, if you look at a freight forwarder that maybe offers their own LCL services versus an LCL consolidator, a company like Vanguard, where do you feel like people that don't really get LCL are going to struggle when offering it as a service?
I think a few areas. Of course, one is knowing the cost. Can you really get confident visibility of your cost from A to B? You have multiple vendors, you have your origin cost, you have your destination cost. How do you make that transparent and committed? How do you ensure that the customer knows that what they pay and there aren't surprises along the way? So to one degree, that has been a big part of it. I think another part of it is knowing how the service performs. Can you, once you have a price, is it executable? Do you know that that's how the cargo will move? Does it move as you expect it to move and perform in the time frame that you expect? So LCL has an obligation to simplify those for shippers. Being able to put it into the hands of freight forwarders and partners, making it simple to be confident that from A to B, my cost is $1,000. It'll take 23 days. I understand how it's moving. I can interact with how it's moving and be confident that the service performs as expected.
Gotcha. And I guess one more question before we move on from this. And this is probably maybe being informed a little bit more about what's happening in non-logistics spaces, but you talk about having an LCL network. How important is it for a LCL forwarder or somebody that offers LCL services to actually own that network rather than it being more of a platform where it's different nodes? For example, do you need to actually own in-house those consolidation warehouses on the origin or destination, or how much of it can actually be done together as more of a platform connecting different companies rather than having that internally?
Yeah. No, excellent question. There's one thing to own the operations and the operation drives the network. There's another thing to actually own the assets that are executing the network. So in a Vanguard world, we think it's important that you're able to take responsibility for the cargo from A to B, that it's your own business, it's your own people, it's your own SOPs, it's your own technology, your own ERP, that are controlling and taking responsibility for how that cargo flows. And in a Vanguard world today, 80% plus is moving under the operations of Vanguard. Of course, in the background, well, which carrier do we really work with? Maersk, OO, or is it our own CFS or not? Is it our own trucks or not? I think it's very hard for any logistic company to own all of that. You can own how it performs. You can make choices around where it's valuable for you to own it as your own proposition. But what is more important is that you own the operations, you own the responsibility of the cargo from A to B.
I have to imagine that that 20%, let's say that's not necessarily owned, right? It's relatively easy, and I would never say it's easy, but it's easier to create an internal, robust technology stack and make sure that every single person with Vanguard or within any organization will kind of stay compliant to that. LCL by nature is a little bit less structured than FCL, right? It's never just you have a lot more parameters, a lot more variables, obviously running around. When working with external vendors, how do you actually bring them into your technology network? Like, how important is that everybody's working on one platform, on one unified system, or how else do you integrate or work together with that 20%? Because I think that's probably a pretty common problem, whether you're a carrier or a forwarder or a shipper. It's really trying to think how you can actually integrate those systems together. So how do you actually pull that off on the Vanguard side?
Yes, we have a very active agent program. Almost all of them are strategic partners to us in one way. They make us relevant in terms of serving the globe for customers. And there are several ways in which we work through it. One of them is that we start to harmonize the front end of delivering our product to customers. Whether we integrate through web platforms with agents, whether it's through EDI connectivity, that there are many that we function that way. In some ways, it's about how we standardize the SOPs and how we work with them, as a network. But ultimately, what we look for is the consistency of data flow into the Vanguard environment so that we can best represent that network and we can best represent those agents in the network as well. Customers are looking for that consistency across the network, and it is very much around the integration of SOPs, the integration of data, bringing that into a common workflow and technology for customers.
I love that. That's such a great metric of looking at the consistency of data. I think that's a great that's a great way to look at it. So moving on, kind of towards the solutions. One maybe this is kind of a mental model that I've been using for LCL a little bit, where it's very easy, and I think I use this chart always because I'm still blown away by this data that cargo capacity utilization or load factors on airlines is so much worse than it is on the passenger side, where because it's a core revenue driver for so many passenger airlines, they've put a lot more work into dynamic pricing and better allocation, better predictability around individual around passenger flight, but the cargo side hasn't necessarily got the same amount of love from a technology standpoint. And I kind of use that as the mental model for LCL, where you really just want to maximize your utilization of any given FCL. And a consolidator, of course, getting such a wide variety of different sizes and loads is really probably positioned quite well to take advantage of technology in order to maximize both your own revenue, but also pass on the best prices to your customers. So I guess, looking at the strategy over the past couple of years, how have you looked at tech to really drive better LCL shipping, whether on the service side, internal efficiencies, or on the pricing side?
In several ways, and you touched a little bit on utilization, but the first question for us is about easy to do business with. And very early on, you commented it must be an interesting time to be a head of strategy in shipping today, when there are so many moving parts, so many new entrants, so many new ideas about how the industry might work in the coming 10 years. So a big part of it really is how to be easy to do business with and be relevant to all of those partners in the logistics ecosystem in the coming 10 years. Part of that is simplifying LCL. How do we give our network to other people to work with us? How can we do it in an automated way, in a discoverable way, in a simplified way that you can have LCL as a core part of your supply chain? What comes with that, of course, is that the more that you automate, then you become more efficient as an organization. And certainly in discovering LCL, people will quote more. People will search for LCL through different channels. Ultimately, that means we need to be more effective, more accurate at quoting. And we need to rely on the system to be able to do that. 10-time quoting, but a lower level of quote to booking conversion requires some efficiency for us to achieve. So I think particularly along those levels, we're also focused that for us, that simplification and automation need to be executable. To find a price, to distribute LCL through different channels, it's not really what sets it apart. It's, can I move it? Can I move it easily? Can I incorporate it into the solution for customers that I'm building in the freight ecosystem? Well, those will become more important in the future.
Yeah, that's interesting. When talking about logistics to end users or to other partners, and particularly on the integration side, I'm always reminded that so many customers don't actually care about how the sausage is made, right? What they're looking for that initial input of price, and once they book that, they just don't want to hear about it until it's actually delivered, right? I think a perfect shipment is an invisible shipment, and everything else beyond that is noise. If you had to throw out a rough estimate of what percentage of your tech that you've been working on is designed around customer-facing improvements, for example, instant pricing, which would help them book faster and have a better experience, versus internal efficiencies, where would you throw out that number of the right mix of development?
Yeah, and it's loose. I would say probably 50-60% of our focus today is on the customer. How do we integrate with freight forwarders? How do we provide our network to partners such as Freightos? The vast majority is focused there. There is another piece where we are focused on data. Probably another 30% of our time is focused on as I said, that consistency, accuracy of the data that we present. So, and of course, what comes with that is the more that we enable our customers, the more efficient we become ourselves anyway. Mm-hmm. Almost the efficiency is from enabling our customers than it is finding a better way of doing A and B internally at Vanguard. Doesn't mean to say we don't do that. Absolutely. For us to be a winning vendor in freight, we need to be efficient and cost effective. They remain priorities, but the balance today is how do we become more efficient with customers and lending our network to them, and that helps our own business.
Right. Do you feel, for a while I used to look at it and at freight forwarders or carriers and kind of wonder where the automation is, and then over time it became clear to me that it doesn't make sense for a business to necessarily invest in capabilities if their customers aren't demanding it, right? Like at the end of the day, most of what you really want to be working on is what keeps customers happy. And then it started to maybe trickle down through my thick skull that possibly customers just aren't prioritizing that. And when they come and they source a new vendor, they're saying, let's negotiate, let's put together an annual contract. Let's talk about our tender. Let's talk about service levels, demurrage costs. But they're not saying, what are your technology capabilities, or do you offer a shipment management portal, or do you offer a live API stream for milestone tracking? Is that are you feeling demand from customers to adapt technology, or is that being driven internally because there's an assumption that that's what customers want?
Both. I think the industry as a whole is on a journey to reimagine what it can take to the customer. All of our customers are approaching Vanguard around how can we support them in their journeys. Everybody is taking different technology journeys, different product journeys to do so. And it's a little bit internal for us, which is, well, how do we ensure that Vanguard is fit for whatever the customer needs may be in the future? So we have to do a little bit of anticipation, mm-hmm. as well as working with the priorities for today. And I think it's unclear, are there emerging winners yet of what the new customer needs will be, or the proposition for the future? We have a lot in quoting systems and things like that, but the customer is still interested in picking up the phone and making sure they got the right rate. So what the customer needs will be in the future, I think we still learn. What will be winning propositions, we still learn. What I do believe is that there will be a multiplicity of solutions. Different mm-hmm. customers want different needs. Different customers will enter a tipping point that says, this is really solving my needs, and this is how I like to work, whether it is supply chain optimization, freight management, marketplaces. I think all of them will be relevant. And we at Vanguard need to ensure that we can support those customer needs to however they source them in the market.
Yeah, that's interesting. I totally agree. I think that one interesting thing that's been happening is that you might have historically had a customer who sources their freight company based on price or based on region or even based on specific expertise, let's say temperature controlled or LCL expertise. And now you actually have another parameter where there's some customers that are very interested in technology solutions, and that might become part of their RFP, but there's others that couldn't care less, and they naturally filter out. But one of the interesting components there is that as more companies start to adapt those solutions, you probably do hit a tipping point where a certain type of offering becomes almost standard. And then it wouldn't be in the RFP because it's obvious for you that you wouldn't work with a company that doesn't have online quoting or shipment management of some sort. That's interesting. We've spoken to during the course of the series, to a couple of different companies. I'm thinking of Air France, KLM, and Maersk, who are both talking a little bit about how successful they've been at pushing their customers towards online booking. I think the gentleman from Air France KLM said that it became much easier during COVID when they basically said, we don't have salespeople available to answer your calls, so you need to go online. And that created a certain tipping point. And Maersk tried to do the same thing with Spot. Do you feel like you've been successful in pushing customers to go online to quote, or and are you comfortable sharing kind of percentages of how many of them have actually gone online?
Yeah, I mean, we have in many ways. And remember, a large part of our business model is through partners, predominantly focused with freight forwarders. Many freight forwarders we have EDI connectivity with. We have automated booking processes. So to a certain degree, we already starting from the system strategies of freight forwarders. Where it becomes more interesting then is, well, what about the other channel to market? How do we better serve small and medium-sized forwarders? How do we better serve companies that are looking at supply chain solutions? And to a certain degree, in those sectors where the investment in technology may be a little less, we need to have solutions and partners to work with to make them more successful. And that will be a behavioral change. As I mentioned earlier, I would say the smaller the customer or smaller the forwarder, the more manual the process becomes, and the more individually involved they may be in their freight procurement. And of course, what we like to do is bring everybody up to a common level of performance solutions that they have available in the industry.
Awesome. So moving on to I think one of my favorite parts of what's changing about the industry. I think I have this very clear model that we always talk about, especially for people outside of the industry, of the carriers that sell to the forwarders who sell to the shippers, and consolidators are an interesting place. You're at a very interesting place within the ecosystem. And I don't know if you agree with the way that I've put together this diagram, but you're kind of an additional layer on top of there, driving value, obviously, and building very specific expertise that I think a lot of the carriers don't have, right? Even though we've seen a lot of carriers starting to sell online, they've all shied away from even touching LCL so far, it seems. So I'm curious for kind of your view of where you fit into the changing ecosystem, and kind of how you think that might change going forward. Like, if you zoom forward 10 years, will there still be a place for consolidators where carriers start to shift over to trying to own that themselves, the same way that it seems like they're doing on the containerized side? Will you end up competing directly with freight forwarders? Like, how do you actually see this playing out over the next decade or so?
There are lots of angles there. I think, the first thing to start with is that LCL exists because you need critical mass to cover all of the services that the A to B point for customers. If you're going to be genuinely flexible for small pieces of cargo, or you have to have the critical mass to be able to fill up a container and drive utilization. And to a certain degree, unless you're very big, maybe there are 40-50% of the trade lanes where you could build your own buyer's console, but you'll always find yourself short in more esoteric, more direct points inland in the US, other trades. But we function as a carrier, and I think in your diagram early on, ultimately, why did the freight forwarder exist? Well, the freight forwarder brings a certain set of capability to customers in being able to manage logistic flows. And I think really the question is as well, how the customer needs change. If you think about the air travel industry today, I can book with British Airways, I can book with Expedia, I can book with lastminute.com. I may have a freight management type service in Amex corporate travel. The list goes on. So, for us, ultimately, we're the British Airways, we're the Maersk of LCL. Will be relevant for people that don't have the critical mass to do their own consolidation. And it's more than, well, who is building the solution for customers, and how do we work with them to ensure that they have access to an LCL network?
Mm-hmm. The critical mass is interesting. I completely understand from a forwarder perspective. On the carrier side, do you feel like ocean liners are missing key capabilities in order to effectively replicate it? Like, it is possibly the fact that a consolidator can be ocean liner agnostic, but a carrier can't necessarily do that. Is that a key differentiator that ensures consolidator viability?
Um, Again, different ways of looking at it. I think we're very proud of the people, the knowledge, the management of the cargo through warehouses across the globe. That takes a degree of scale and focus and expertise. If it's not your core business, can you deliver that everywhere? If your core business is running vessels, absolutely. People's core business will be owning the customer, but it comes again back to, well, how much do you need to manage yourself or own yourself versus where is it best to partner? And we would like to see ourselves as being a good partner for people that see the best way of accessing the capability. The Vanguard, we have LCL dedicated processes, LCL dedicated network, CFS operations, inland solutions. That takes a degree of focus, and that is what we're focused on. We have it in 35 countries and many more if you add in all of our agents. So I tend to look at it in that way. It is, those are skills, they are processes. LCL is complicated. How do you ensure that it flows well, that two or three of the shipments in the container don't hold up the other two or three shipments? That's an important thing. And for SCL, you have one customer, and if one goes wrong, it's one customer. And in LCL, if one goes wrong, well, it affects 12 or 13 customers. So being good at that is important.
Yeah, and I think that actually tracks with the external non-logistics trends, where for a long time it was plays around aggregation, one size fits all, an Amazon kind of sorts, and that's kind of been snapping back towards direct to consumer brands that say, Amazon might be good for everything, but we're really good at this thing, and we don't want to be the everything store, we want to be the thing store, and when you want your thing, you come here. So I think that really makes sense. Moving on to the last question here, and I think that this actually tracks really well with things that you were talking about before. Obviously, for anyone who follows technology, they've seen that Stripe, which is a payment facilitator, and for a lot of high tech companies, recently shot up to nearly $100 billion valuations, like astronomical valuations. And a big part of that driver was that they're integrated everywhere, right? When somebody checks out on Freightos.com, they might be using Stripe in order to check out and pay with their credit card. You can see similar things with Uber, building apps and building APIs so that they don't need to be their distribution agent. If you're ordering food, you can use Uber in order to actually pull that off. And you kind of alluded to that, and maybe I just want to double click a little bit on it. As a unique service provider, like what is the drive for you to integrate? Or you talked about distribution, but what are the other drivers there? And when you integrate, and maybe this is the more important question, when you integrate, you're basically giving up a little bit of control to some extent. You're letting somebody else do something with your technology that you didn't do yourself. How do you manage to do that while ensuring that you have flexibility and kind of building resilience, even though you're exposing capabilities or services externally?
Yeah. No, both very key. As people will know, Vanguard, has had 45 years of history of supporting, freight forwarders and be successful in LCL. So ultimately, again, the driver is, well, can we support the freight forwarders build their own customer proposition to be successful in shipping? And that comes, whether that is efficiency, expanding the product, integration. So in many ways, that's driving the need to integrate. How do we simplify the product so that the freight forwarders themselves are best able to serve customer needs? And that is true when you start to think about new entrants, new business models. well, how are we simplifying LCL so it's available for innovation in these new business models? But as you said, perhaps the more interesting question is, well, how do you control for flexibility? I think we start really from the building blocks of what are the core processes in LCL? How do we have common language about those core processes in LCL? How do we package those into a toolkit that then customers can be flexible about tapping into? Largely we're doing it through standard EDI messages. We're doing it through an API toolkit. But it is important that one of the beauties of an API in particular is that the customer experience is owned by our customer, the freight forwarder in this case, or Freightos. And really, the API is the spaghetti that you can, or the wires that you can plug in to link into. So I think customers will increasingly innovate their own customer experience, their flows, their user interface, and then they will have the nodes, if you like, into a Vanguard business. But they do need to be relatively common. If we over-customize with a given customer, well, then we render both businesses slightly inflexible. And in particular for Vanguard, because we're sharing our network, most of our customers are looking at, well, how do we work with Vanguard? How do we work with Merck? How do we work with EQ? How do we work with Shipco? Well, in order to bring that to your customer solution, you need to be able to work in a common way across the partners that you're working with. Again, an API is standard. It gives customers options around whether they talk to Vanguard and where they in technology speak. But we build out that menu so that you can pick the right courses that you like to have in your customer journey.
Awesome. All right. Well, moving over to some of the questions that we got filed before the webinar started. So to what extent do you see the changes in LCL directly impacting carriers?
I think the main thing really is LCL is having another moment of being more interesting, and that carriers will approach it in different ways, and it will be the option of which bits do they do themselves, which bits do they work with third parties for. And if anything, I think the carriers, because we're trying to talk to the customer more frequently as an industry, I think the carriers will look a little bit more at, well, how do I offer LCL in parallel to FCL, in parallel to other capabilities that I see customers needing. So I think you'll see more of a dialogue. You'll see a lot more work going on around how we work more together. And of course, you'll see different approaches around, well, where do I partner? Where do I build? Where do I have good demand to run myself? Where do I need someone else to help me?
Gotcha. All right. My most important question is, what is your favorite pizza topping?
Pepperoncini.
Okay, that's a very common answer. Very common answer. All right, I guess there's a reason behind it. From your side, I was actually pretty surprised to see this question. I figured we'd include it just to get your take on it. Do you see any compliance concerns that are unique to LCL?
I think where people start to question here is that if you are enabling smaller shippers over time, well, how do you manage for that complexity, that risk, or the inexperienced shipper in the flows? And of course, as a carrier, particularly where things are moving on our own bill of lading, we do have obligation to ensure compliance. Goods that are being shipped are being shipped. We're not handling shipment to barred countries or from barred individuals. For us, does it change? Not a lot. We already have a very extensive compliance program. In LCL, because you tend to see the freight a bit more, you have a few more opportunities to be sure. But I think in the future, people will start to use data more to AI and automated analytics to understand and pre-qualify shippers in the future.
Gotcha. All right, so I think we have time for one more question here. Let's stick with this one. Do you think that NVOCCs do direct sales to retailers similar to what carriers are doing right now?
Yeah, I think it's a big question, and of course we follow the strategies of others and the carriers in particular. Again, I come back to what are the customer needs and who has the capability for them, and there are many capabilities that an NVOCC like us doesn't have. We're not in supply chain management. We're not really fully fledged 3PL. We're not customs. We're not purchase order management and those types of things. So we see it less as, well, are we going to go direct to shipper? We see it more as, well, who are building customer solutions and how do we support them in being successful? It's too big a stretch. We're a network. We are a carrier, and we like all of our partners to be successful in growing, meeting customer needs.
Awesome. All right. Well, Graham, thank you so much. This was such a fun conversation. It was really interesting to learn a little bit more about the LCL side. So I appreciate you joining us.
No, and I appreciate the time and the conversation. Enjoyed the session with you all.
Awesome. And for everyone tuning in, thanks so much for joining. Hope you found this as interesting as I did. WebCargo and Freightos do have a couple of recent reports around both smaller mid-sized buyers as well as online freight sales trends that you can get on our website. And I suggest you popping on there and download them. If you're interested, you can get them at webcargo.co or freightos.com in our logistics research section. We'll be doing our next session in another 3 weeks. We'll be hosting the Chief Technology Officer from MSC, Andre Simcha. We're going to be talking a little bit about bills of lading, which might not sound like the most fascinating topic, but I think it's actually the kind of one of the leading charges towards digitization within ocean freight. So it should be very interesting. That's it from our side. Thank you so much for joining. Graham, thanks again. And everybody have a great day.